Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to the latest episode of our JPS webinar series. My name is Nadim Bawalsa, and I'm the Associate Editor at the Journal of Palestine Studies. I'm very honored to be here moderating this discussion on the new Palestinian memoir with four brilliant Palestinian authors who all published their debut memoirs in 2025. Congratulations to you all, and thank you for being with us today. Um, Amid Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza and its expanding campaign of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, four Palestinian scholars, activists, and writers in exile have published their debut memoirs, charting a new path in the long and beloved tradition of the Palestinian memoir. Abdalhadi, Alijla's Fearful in Gaza, recounts the author's childhood growing up under siege in Gaza and surviving repeated Israeli wars before being exiled to Europe. In I'll Tell You When I'm Home, Hala Alyan narrates her experience of motherhood through surrogacy while grappling with a legacy of displacement. Tareq Baconi's Fire in Every Direction intertwines Baconi's personal reflections on growing up queer in Amman with the intergenerational story of his family's exile from Palestine. And May Serhan's I Can Imagine It for Us is a lyrical account of Serhan's journey to reconcile with her complicated father and her stolen homeland. Abdalhadi is a social and political scientist, a non-resident senior fellow at the and a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative, author of Fearful in Gaza and Trust in Divided Societies, and co-editor of Rebel Governance in the Middle East. He won first place in the 2025 Un Mundo di Parole Internazionale Literary Contest in Italy. Hala Alyan is the author of two novels, including the award-winning Salt Houses, five collections of poetry, and I'll Tell You When I'm Home, her debut memoir. Her work has been published by The New Yorker, the Academy of American Poets, The New York Times, The Guardian, and Guernica. She's a clinical psychologist and professor at New York University. Tara is a Palestinian writer, scholar, and activist. His work has appeared in the New York Times and the Baffler, among other outlets, and he contributes essays to the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books. He is the author of Hamas Contained, A History of Palestinian Resistance, and Fire in Every Direction, his debut memoir. And finally, last but not least, May is a Palestinian writer, translator, editor, and creative writing tutor. She's the author of Cairo, The Undelivered Letters, winner of the 2022 Center for Book Arts Poetry Award, and I Can Imagine It for Us, winner of the 2022 Narratively Memoir Prize. Her work has appeared in LitHub, Electric Literature, Michigan Quarterly Review, Magma Poetry, The London Magazine, and elsewhere. Thank you again for being with us today. Before we start the discussion, I'd like to remind our audience that the Institute for Palestine Studies, without which JPS does not exist and without which events like these would not be possible, depends on your continued support. At a time where knowledge production around Palestine is being criminalized and suppressed, IPS is in urgent need of your help. Please support us if you can by donating through the link that'll appear in the chat box. Thank you. So I want to start with a question for our speakers today. You're all young writers. What inspired you to write these memoirs and why now? Please share your journeys with us. Abdalhadi, let's start with you.
Uh, thank, thank you very much, everyone, and thanks Nadim for inviting me. The idea of this book, it came as a response to grief. Many of actually some of my friends and family members know that I started to write this in 2018, and not recent, as a response to the 2014 war in Gaza and 2009, 2008, where I lost many of my family members at that time. But I took it seriously after my father died while I was in Beirut. He was in Gaza, and I was denied to go to Gaza to pay farewell for him after 16 years in exile. So it came as an act of resistance, an act of grief. That's the main the parting point of this memoir. But also, when I started to write it more and became more into academia and writing, I thought like academia itself was not enough for Gaza to explain Gaza itself. Gaza has been always treated by academia who studied Palestine and Palestinian studies as the black sheep. If you look at it, we didn't have so much about the oral history of Gaza, about the Gaza, the society of Gaza. It was always the black sheep. So that's one of the reason. And then what happens after war is the dehumanization of Gaza. And I'm not talking here about the ongoing genocide, the most recent genocide, let's call it. But what I mean here is the dehumanization of Gaza started a long time before this new wave of genocide. And as a response to this, I wanted to write something and produce something that's natural, without sanctification, without perceiving or a glory for Gazans, and without presenting Gazans as the heroes. We are humans, and that's the whole book is about. I wanted to have something, and then two things after purpose of this. One is I wanted to confront the idea of dehumanizing Gaza, one thing. And then I want to place Gaza that used to exist. So now we are talking about the past. The place Gaza that used to exist, because Gaza that I know, I grew up in, doesn't exist anymore. If you look at, for example, how many of my friends or classmates that's still alive, I don't have many still alive. I mean, maybe then more than 60% of them have already died. I remember before the genocide, I stopped counting in 2014, 24. That's 2014. So that is a response to this. So I wanted to put gods that I know into the language of words, and there where this book coming from.
Thank you, Abdulhadi. Hala, uh, shall we move on to you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with you all. Um, you know, I feel like my response is much less kind of thoughtful because the process of writing this book was less thoughtful in many ways. And by that I mean actually did not set out to write a memoir. I sold this project as a collection of essays, kind of in the like post-pandemic era when I happened to also be going through a bunch of infertility issues. And so it was really pitched and marketed and bought as a um like, a kind of a psychologist musing on different concepts. So the concept of dread, the concept of exile, nostalgia, etc. And then once I started working with the editor, she, I think very rightfully started to point out that there was a connective tissue that was missing in the stories and that I was sort of trying really hard to write around the things that I think just needed to write about, which was more directly my life, my family history, my own kind of how I had gotten to the US, what had happened in the lineage before me to get me here, etc. And then how that was impacting my current, struggle with motherhood and trying to figure out if I would, be able to have a child, etc. And so it's really now in hindsight, it's interesting because I actually was really quite resistant to the idea of writing kind of the I more shamelessly, just kind of the memoiristic I. And it took a lot of back and forths, and I tried to sort of shift it into something more like a prose poem kind of thing, more vignette, more lyrical essay, etc. And then my editor said to me, kind of really beautifully, just an invitation. She was like, "What would happen if you just told the story of what was happening right now?" and then weaving in all of these other things that you seem to be interested or want to be writing about. And then that's what led to the book. And I think it was, it's not generally what we advise, like, young writers or writing students to do. It was like writing about the trauma as it was unfolding very much, and as it was sort of taking place in the side of my body. But then while I kind of found a container for the story, which was the year before my daughter was born via surrogate. And in that year, that was also the year where there was the attack on Gaza in 2021. It was the 1 year anniversary of the port explosion in Beirut, where I'd spent almost a decade of my life, where all of these other sites of memory and destruction and exile were also kind of being activated in these different ways. And so I think I had been afraid of trying to write directly about myself because it wouldn't do justice to everything that came before me. Um, and then finally relented and just said, well, if I just tell this one story, everything else will work its way into it. And everything that needs to find its way in will find its way in. And so I think for me, it was really just a matter of like trusting that the narrative was sturdy enough and that in the end it would do service to everything that had kind of come before, which was like a big and continues to sort of be a big preoccupation of mine. But yeah, my journey is a little bit different in that I didn't set out saying I'm writing a memoir. In fact, I kind of fought it for a long time.
Thank you, Hala. Tariq,
Thank you, Nadim. I just want to say thank you, JPS, for this. It's wonderful to be in this platform with these panelists. All these memoirs are incredible, so I'm honored to be with you all. Um, I think I'm in some ways closer to Hala actually in terms of how I wrote this book. I never wanted to write a memoir. And sometimes I'm still in disbelief that I ended up writing a memoir. It's just not what I intended to do. What took me back to this book was it's something that I always knew that I would write, which is the core story at the heart of this book, which is a love story between two boys in Amman. And I always knew that this is a story that I wanted to write because when I was living through that experience, I didn't have the words to I didn't have the words to explain to myself or to Ramzi, the other boy, the experience of what it meant to grow up in Amman, to fall in love with another boy, to have that kind of just relationship that was unfolding organically. And a whole set of things happened that ultimately land me in London. And very, very shortly after leaving Amman, I knew that this was a story I would return to. I knew that once I knew how to recount that story, once I had the words, once I had the emotional bandwidth and understanding of what had happened, that I would come back to it. And so, lo and behold, 2 years, 2 decades later, after my first book comes out, I turned to writing this relationship, this friendship, this love story as an experiment, as a creative project. And that's really the entry point into the book. And before I know it, the book is taking me to Haifa and to Gaza and to Amman and Beirut and London and all of the places that I had lived in. And obviously now that makes sense. If you're writing the story, if I was writing the story of two boys in Amman, the boys are Palestinian. Why are they in Amman? And what are their households and who are their parents and what are their grandparents doing? And so very quickly it became a story about the Nakba and dispossession and how we carry Palestine with us from birth onwards, and just trying to recreate the ecosystem of these two boys meant that it was inseparable from an ecosystem of dispossession and exile. And so it became a book about Palestine. In some ways, I describe this book as a book about Palestine and a book about queer love. And the two are very much intertwined for me when I think about this book, but also when I think about my life. And so it's a reflection of that. But I really struggled for a long time to sort of approach this as oh, I'm writing my life story. I really, up until now, it sits uneasily with me. I have to say, particularly at a moment of genocide, this book was written and completed before the genocide. It was completed in September 2023, and so I would have never imagined it coming out in this moment. And there's something that's deeply unsettling about being in a place of talking about autobiography in a moment of mass death. And obviously, we can rationalize all of the ways that it's also important. And as Abdalhadi says, it's also an act of human of fighting dehumanization. It's an act of grief. It's an act of resistance. I agree with all of that. But there's something still very unsettling about just living in these sort of dual temporalities where we're publishing and we're talking and we're doing these events, and there's mass death on our phones that we're witnessing every day. And I think that's really just an unsettling space to be.
Thank you, Tareq. May, let's end with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Nadim, for hosting, and to GPS for bringing us together. Like Tareq, I wrote this before October 7th. I finished it in 2022. But the idea for it germinated during a writing residency in 2018. We were asked on the first day to respond to a writing prompt about where we're from. And I wrote the seed for this memoir, which was only half a page. And it started with, I have never been to the place where I'm from, which actually made it into the memoir, this line. And then I turned it into a flash memoir and got it published. But I always knew that this would be a blueprint to a much larger story, a bigger story about my father and about Palestine, but also about me and the peculiarity of my experience in China. Like at that point, until today, really, no one's ever written a book about two Palestinians in China. So that was number one for me. But also, what did it mean to be a Palestinian who's never been to Palestine? And what did it mean to me to live and feel like my Palestinianness is so inherent to me? I live with it, I feel it, I perceive it, I observe it in everything I do. What was I carrying, and how did it inform the way I moved in the world? I wanted to explore these questions. But I also knew that this was a story that was much bigger than me, and that there were millions of Palestinians in diaspora like me who had never been to Palestine. So there was also this need to connect with other people, for me not to feel alone, but also for whoever I'm going to reach out to not to feel alone. The opportunity to write it came during my MFA in creative writing. It was a hybrid program, and we were exposed to like reading and writing in every genre. So that really, for me, opened the ceiling of possibilities of what I can do with this. This idea of genre is very Western, and it's essentially a construct. So what can I do with an experience that is largely unrecognized and undefined? I don't need to abide by these conventions at all. But also I wanted to write a voice-driven memoir, one that would uniquely define me as May. And in that, I was hoping to gain a sense of authorship over the narrative. And that's it. Yeah.
Thank you all. I'm very moved by these personal reflections on the origins of these beautiful books. There's so many similarities, so many obviously unique traits, or unique aspects to each of your works and each of your journeys. But just the idea that all of these books were published in the same year by coincidence, and none of you had sort of been in touch and been in contact about these projects. It's incredible, in the longer history of the Palestinian memoir. I don't believe there was ever a year in which 4 Palestinian memoirs emerged, certainly not against the backdrop of mass murder and genocide. Another thing is that you're all in exile. Abdalhadi, you being the only one to have been born and raised in Palestine, but also writing in exile. So, these are, all that's also, this is why I see it as a new genre within Palestinian autobiography, because the most of the literature we have, memoirs of Palestinians still in Palestine, for example, or of another generation. So, I want to move on now to questions, sort of catered to each of you and each of your projects. Abdalhadi, let's go back to you. Your memoir is set in Gaza over the course of 40 years or so. And it's unsurprising that Sumud is a powerful theme in your pages. There's no doubt that the Palestinians of Gaza embody Sumud more than any of us, than anyone else on this planet. Yet the genocide has also revealed the limits of Sumud, as many from Gaza have written and said over the last couple of years. As a Palestinian exiled from Gaza who suffered untold pain and loss, what's your relationship to the term and concept of Sumud, and how do you handle it in your book?
Thank you, Nadim, for this great question. This question reminded me of last year's discussion that erupted among Gazans on social media in the middle of genocide about the concept of Sumud. They were discussing what is Sumud, what is to be living in Gaza at that time. And the debate went on and on for a few days, actually, about Gaza. Is it the lack of alternative? Is it the nationalism? It's the love of Palestine, the attachment to the land. So Sumud has been always part of our lives. And I think for us as in Gaza, Sumud is not an abstract, or it's not in as a concept in a fancy book published by the University of Columbia Press. And it is not a nice anthropological term that's published in Journal of Palestine Studies. No, it's not for us. Sumud, I think it's about loving, smiling, cooking, going to work, daily routine, surviving the colonial apartheid conditions, and so on. So we don't feel that idea of someone. We don't feel it, but we do it. We don't frame it. We don't theorize it. We just live it. And that's how the Sumud facing the brutality of the colonialism that's aimed from the beginning to ethnically cleanse us and to break us as Palestinians, but also mainly on Gaza in the last 50 years. So Gaza has always reflected an uncompromised Sumud. And we need to remember that Gaza is the only remaining city of historical Palestine on the Mediterranean. And that's give it a uniqueness that its sumud is a preservation of the narrative of the Palestinians, of the Palestinian history itself as well. And when it comes to the genocide, here is the concept of sumud have become a little bit tricky because it's become more painful. It takes the limit. It becomes a burden on the victim. And it's exactly what happened to us. Imagine somebody losing all his family in one night. Imagine losing 50 or 70, like myself, 70, more than 70 of my family, for example. These kind of things, sumud has a limit. But what I mean here is what is more painful for Sumud here during the genocide is romanticization of the Sumud, which is even more painful. And that's why I don't mean that Sumud is bad, but also Sumud itself didn't protect us from annihilation, from the genocide. And people who are celebrating this kind of Sumud didn't do much to stop the genocide or even try to change the conditions where the Palestinians are under genocide. But so here, I mean, Sumud has risked in the last 2 years to be an unending romanticized suffering of Gazans. But my relationship with Sumud, I think I think it's shaped by and historical, like since I was born, by love, by admiration, by anger, by grief. But I am more angry at people who romanticize this kind of Sumud or without understanding the brutal conditions of Gaza themselves. So, but in the book, in Fearful in Gaza, I didn't actually frame Samud. I wrote it, and I think you are the first one who to pick up this word Samud within the book, because I was writing living practices of people, normal people, love, families, siblings, schools, neighborhoods. There was this kind of bonds that the act itself became part of the Samud without knowing. So it's not it's not a concept rather than just a living experience, and that's why I maybe I when I wrote the book, I tried to just avoid any kind of terminology, avoid any kind of historization of Palestine. I just talk about the Nakba from my story with my mother when she told me, like, when I asked her, when were you born? When she answered me, like, I was born in the Sanat al-Nakba. That's the stories that comes from. So I expressed it, finally, I would say I expressed Sumud as an integral attachment to the land and memory and the practices of our previous generations.
Thank you, Abdalhadi. That was very powerful, very, very moving. We recently published a co-authored piece by several Gazans living and working in Europe, who reflect on how dehumanizing the concept of sumud can be, because it romanticizes Gazans as these supernatural humans, when actually Gazans are capable of, Gazans grieve, Gazans feel pain, Gazans feel loss, just like everyone else. So actually, Sumud sort of paradoxically does the opposite of what it should do, right? It should paint a reality that isn't one to romanticize and think makes it's other, other human. No, it's a reality where Palestinians in Gaza especially are forced to reckon with and to realize but it's not something that should be praised as sort of otherworldly and beyond human. Um, Hala, let's move on to you. Um, your memoir conveys the instability, the anguish, and the messiness of Palestinian exile. This is evident in your personal journey through pregnancy, through dependence on alcohol, and through painful relationships. It's also evident in a life spent searching for home, right? As the title of your memoir makes clear, and you moved across so many geographies in your book. What is the place of exile and displacement and this concept of home in your reflection, and how do they color the narrative of your struggle? I guess in a way, also, why did you choose to call it, why did you choose to title it
Yeah.
outside you?
I mean, I think it's a bit, if I can, just to go back to the conversation on Smooth too, I think really quickly, just to say, like, also what ends up happening is that you're forcing people to be made extraordinary, because what is actually extraordinary is the degree of savagery and barbaric destruction that's being done. And so you're flipping it, and so you're talking about the people surviving it, but really what's extraordinary is that what's unprecedented, what's outside the norm is the slaughter, it's the occupation, it's the like that's what anyway, sorry. um and now for my little tongue-in-cheek title. I mean, I think it was a little bit playful. I think I mean, it's I'm writing to a you throughout the book. I, like other folks here, wrote this before the genocide, probably had a very similar existential crisis about whether to even publish it that people here had. What is the point of this story and in this moment, etc. Um, but it was written parts of it were written before Layla, before my daughter was even born, and so the you was very much kind of a yearning you, like this hopeful you, this you that I was trying to sort of will and wish into being. And so it's sort of a play on the idea of telling her when I slash she slash we are home, because a lot of this story is also kind of realizing that I in the end would not be able to carry. So she's biologically ours, but was carried by a surrogate, and kind of making peace with that idea that I would not be her first home for all intents and purposes. I would not be the first heartbeat that she heard. I would not be the first voice that she heard. And then having like this feeling of that there was this sort of metaphor of exile in that too, that she was being held and carried in a body that was across the border from where I was. The stakes are nowhere near real exile, but it was just post-pandemic. It wasn't that easy. I didn't get to meet the person that the wonderful woman who gave birth to her until the day that she went into labor, and so spent those months really kind of feeling that distance, and then contending with the psychological idea of nesting when you're not the one that's going to be birthing and you're not the one that's carrying. And for me, that nesting looked a lot like just taking stock of what I had to offer this being and this creature someday, inshallah. And of course, a big part of that was really looking at the stories of my family who, I mean, there's to this idea of like, what is the place of exile? I mean, I think it has shifted a lot. I think we are, like many people, part of that lineage that got displaced multiple times over. So my father was born in Gaza. His family had been from Al-Majd and Al-Aqswaidan, ended up being born there, went to Kuwait. My mom and him met in Kuwait. And then they ended up, after Saddam's invasion, they were once again kind of scattered. So they and their siblings had sort of set up a life that they thought was going to look like one thing, post-Palestine, and then kind of had to contend with, rebuilding. A bunch of us ended up in Lebanon, where we were in 2006, where we were. So again, like kind of these multiple sort of the ground sort of continuously being shifting was a really normative experience in my family. And for me, as an adolescent, I did my undergrad and my high school in Beirut, which is an interesting place to come of age. And the years that I was there were interesting. So like the Prime Minister, Hariri, was assassinated my freshman year. The 2006, was what happened between sophomore and junior years. So I was sort of coming of age in this place that was like so intensely alive, and also there is a deep amount of violence there as well, both internal and kind of externally wrought. And so I think I just, that you mentioned like the alcoholism, the drinking, the kinds of mercurial relationships I was drawn to, etc. I think they often felt like trying to find footholds in that shifting ground, like trying to find ways to make sense of the places around me. And I almost feel like this idea of like what is the place of displacement is, it's almost a question I've set down because I don't even know how to reckon with it anymore. Like I don't know what I when I close my eyes, the places I long for are not the places my father longs for and are not the places my mother longs for, which is its own kind of heartbreak. And it really denotes kind of the insidious thoroughness of the project of real violent dispossession, right? Is to make it so that, the children of the children aren't even going to have in their imagination the idea of stepping foot in Gaza someday, you know what I mean, or returning to Palestine or whatever. And so I think I speak about that honestly because it is something that I contend with, and I think it's something that a lot of us contend with in exile, is like that sort of mixture of shame and guilt of like uh, that the project has, kind of effectively been enacted on me, in that when I long for a place, I'm longing for the places I was displaced to. And that like the places of origin feel so out of reach and so out of touch. And that has become, especially in the last 2 years, kind of a conscious practice to push against that, to be like actually part of the resistance in exile is to continuously locate yourself in those places, is to continuously practice the imagination of return. That you have to practice it in your art, you have to practice it in your speech, you have to practice it every time I, force myself, even though I'm arguing with a 3.5-year-old about whatever bedtime, to be like, and now say it بالعربي, like say it بالعربي, say it بالعربي. Like it's like those small things feel, especially in light of the genocide, like so the stakes are so high to be doing them, and actually they're infused with quite a bit of meaning. Um, And that's, yeah, well, I completely lost my train of thought. But yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of that's, but I think that this idea of like how to really insist upon an imagined return, insist upon the imagination of stepping foot there, has come to mean something. I mean, I'm somebody that was, I was like Layla was about a year and a couple of months when, no, was she even a year? Yeah, she was a year and a few months when in October of 2023. And then a few months after that, my marriage ended. And so there was this really kind of intense period where it was me and her, and me sort of trying to make sense of what was happening on the television screen, what was happening in my life, what was, and I think in that era, watching the children, I mean, just, yeah, I mean, watching everything, but there was something about watching the children as I was stumbling into new motherhood that I think just kept recommitting this kind of, um, or re-strengthening this commitment. I just felt like I was making a vow over and over and over again that I would not forget what I was seeing and that I would not forget what I was witnessing and that I would try to be as useful of a witness as I could be. And to be humble and to sort of know my place as a witness and to kind of not conflate that with the same as being the one having the experience, and then to ask what then is the task, like what then do I do with the witnessing. And so this is now a couple of years out, like something that I'm just thinking of now of like what do I do with that. Yeah.
I have so much to say, Hala. That was brilliant. Thank you. The next question I have for Tara is something that's very personal to me, and it also has a lot to do with Hala, your response on imagining return and what place being in Amman in Jordan, right across the river. The imagined return is very geographic. It's very rooted in the earth because we are steps away, right? But the impossibility of that has, I think, caused so much trauma for the 6+ million Palestinians, east of the Jordan River. And so maybe we'll segue to the next question for Tariq. The first half of your memoir, Tariq, mostly takes place in Amman, which many forget is home to the largest concentration of Palestinians in the world, or descendants at least of Palestinians in the world. Amman is a generationally very traumatized city, which you show in your book. You seem to achieve your own resolution in many ways by leaving Amman, yet you also keep coming back. And this is something you and I have spoken about quite, several times. Could you tell us more about the place of Amman in this narrative, and perhaps in the broader exiled Palestinian experience?
Sure, thank you, Nadine. I mean, I actually want to take us the part of the format here is I feel like I have so much to say to Abdalhadi about Sumud and so much to say to Hala about her answer as well, and it's you're tormenting us by giving us silos, but I actually want to start with something Hala said about when you're in exile, you're longing to return maybe to a different place, not the place of origin. And it's funny because for me, I never thought of myself being in London as being exiled. I chose to live in London. It was a privileged departure from Amman and landing in London, and I'm sort of. But the place that I long to for the majority of my to return to for the majority of my adulthood wasn't actually a return to Amman. It was a return to Palestine. I sort of felt this need to go, and actually the first time. Growing up as a Jordanian citizen, I wasn't allowed to go to Palestine, as you say, Nadim. It's just down the road and it's inaccessible. But when I naturalized as a British citizen was the first time I was able to go, and the first trip I took with my British passport was to go to Palestine. And it was that longing that I didn't quite understand. It was more embodied, and it was an echo of a longing. I didn't quite understand what this pull was towards Palestine, but it was very much that. But to go back to Amman specifically, I mean, Amman is a peculiar place for many reasons. But I think the thing that grated on me the most, and that I struggled with when I was growing up and continue to struggle with today, is its silences. You think of Amman as this place, as you said, Jordan is the place, the home for the majority of Palestinians in the Shatat. But in many ways, politics is sanitized from the place. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of reasons. It has this is a broad generalization. It varies depending on class, on religion, on place in Jordan, but generally, specifically in Amman, politics is sanitized. So you wouldn't even, even in the height of the genocide, you have boycott campaigns that are relatively successful, and you have some protests. But when you think that very close to Amman, there's mass slaughter of Palestinians, many of whom have family in Amman, and the response is contained and sanitized, it reveals what the violence of the silence in Amman is. It reveals the fact that under this sort of facade of civility and genteelness and certainly neoliberal consumerism, that underneath that there is grief and exile and anger. And somehow Amman manages to be in that space where people are apparently apathetic and apolitical. And I don't know that this is the reality. I do think that people internally are political. I think there are various groupings or spaces where politics is happening, where there's resistance, where there's sort of thinking about what Palestinian liberation looks like. But on the appearance of it, and certainly on the level of the country as the sort of country that's positioning itself outside of the politics of the region, it's a sort of stable place where refugees come to, whether from Palestine or Iraq or Syria or otherwise, and it's sort of above the fray. It leaves a certain kind of violence in that. It sort of sanitizes things that are very complicated and are very enraging, and that actually demand responses and demand resistance. And so I think this is the peculiarity of Amman that I've always struggled with, and in some ways I had to leave to be able to understand myself. I mean, the fact that I'm the descendant of Palestinian refugees and I had to leave Amman to understand my Palestinianness says everything you need to know about Amman. I mean, it's a critique of the educational system, certainly in Jordan, and the fact that it doesn't teach us our history, but it's more than that. But I think one of the things that's very interesting to me is actually how I saw Amman after landing in Haifa. And after sort of going back home to Palestine, understanding that even though I had grown up in Amman, I had actually grown up in Palestine, in the homes that I grew up within the folds of my family, within the friendships that I had. Palestine felt very embodied. It felt a part of me. It didn't feel foreign at all. And so you understand actually this sort of, that even in this city that's I talk about it in the book as being a white city, this sort of whitewashed stones, nothing tarnishes the facade, everything is sanitized, everything is sort of picture perfect. Even in those spaces, Palestine is transmitted to us through our homes, through our food, through our accents, through our gardening, through our, the way that we relate to each other as families in our social fabric. And so I think in that sense, Amman has also kept Palestine alive in a way for me, and it allowed me to sort of, when I went back to Palestine, to feel that I had already been there. And I think that for me was obviously nurtured in Amman. And the last thing I'd say is that in the book, the Amman is pitted against Beirut in many ways. And Beirut is the opposite of that, where Beirut is actually, the politics are on the surface and they're so fast and quick and immediate that it's almost unlivable. And Amman is sort of the other extreme of that, where it sort of avoids the politics in order to enjoy the good life. And the two, I think, are different ways and different experiences of what it means for Palestinians in exile in the Shatat, and how that has shaped their sort of relationship to Palestine itself.
Thank you, Tariq. And wow, these answers are just so incredible. I have so much to say. Just to honor folks that I know who have taken to the streets and who have been very vocal since the genocide here in Amman. The costs are great, as you might know. The suppression has been horrible. But that said, you're absolutely right that politics are sanitized here for a larger display of genteelness and a distancing from the aib and the haram, as you talk about in your book. Absolutely. And it is a delicate balance because, like you, when I first went to Palestine as a US citizen, I did find my Palestinianness um, was very familiar to me because of how recreated it had been throughout my life in Amman, at home with family in the community and so on. So there is a tension there, but absolutely there's a sanitization here that's suffocating. Absolutely. May, let's move on to you. You describe your life and your father's as being spent constantly moving, even without feet, literally, referring to your late father's amputated limb. There's a constant sense of movement, of being uprooted, of fragmented, and being severed throughout the pages of your memoir. And this mirrors, of course, the Palestinian reality in exile, and even within historic colonized Palestine, the fragmentation. Can you describe how you sort of envisioned this mirroring and how you managed to reconcile this fragmentation in your book, if at all?
Yeah, so for me, this is a literary text that also happens to be a true story, right? So, and the true facts uh, readily offered themselves to drama, you know. So the amputated foot as a central metaphor, it worked on multiple levels from the beginning. It mirrored, as you said, the land itself cut into pieces with no mobility between its parts, but also our own severance from the land. Uh, it also spoke about the Palestinian condition in the diaspora at large. So yeah, so that's one. And my job as a storyteller really is to mirror that fragmentation in every aspect of the literary text, right? So I use the fragmented narrative to mirror the spatial and temporal disruption that we've experienced, but also the fragility of memory, you know, in the face of erasure. Um, the movement also between the writing modes, you know, because the book is a historical account and it's a letter to my father, and it has like these essayistic passages. Uh, and Naka is described in this almost poetic way. So all the disruption was also to mirror the fragmentation, you know. The letter, for example, was used for intimacy because I'm addressing my dad. The essay was to slow down the pace of the book because it had a very propulsive pace. So I needed to pause and reflect and look back. The historical account was there to, you know, to support this interior world or this imagined world that I was building through actual fact and so on. So the writing modes, the fragmented narrative, um, we're all there to mirror that experience, but also on the level of language, because as you know, the book has some Chinese dialogue as well, and that was there to alienate you from the text, to make you feel like we're so far away, you know, to push that sense of alienation to an extreme. And it has fusha, and the fusha has where I communicate with the Chinese translator, but also between me and my dad, because I grew up in Egypt, so I speak with an Egyptian accent. And that caused a lot of problems with my dad. So it is a site of conflict, even though Egypt and Palestine they share a border, but even that was a site of conflict in the book. As for how I held it all together, it's through the story. So to have a proper dramatic arc and to recognize that there's a strong sense of place in Akka that would be in contrast to all the digression around it, and high stakes and but what's also as I'm writing the story to make you always want to know what happens next, you know, and that would hold your attention. So to say that even though the story is in pieces, I can still hold it together through the power of the story and make you always want to turn the page to see what's going to happen next, you know. So yeah.
I'll just say that you know all four of these books are gorgeous and beautiful in many ways, but May's reading yours was for many reasons it spoke to me directly, but also it was like moving through something that had this flow to it. It was مش عارف كيف اوصف لك بغير بكلام تاني بس it was jarring, disruptive, but also, as you said, it's literarily very technical, but also, very smooth somehow. Uh, and it does something visceral throughout, every page. It's the poetry or the essay format or the letter format and going back and forth in very short, choppy chapters. It was something, almost visceral for me. Um,
Thank
so
you.
I have one question for you all, just in terms of how you envision your larger contributions, or the contributions of your individual books to the larger tradition of Palestinian memoir writing. There are many themes that are shared in your books, whether it's generationality, parenthood, womanhood, childhood, nature, trees, the land, sumud, return, trauma, pain, refugeehood, so on. But you also chart something very different, all of you being around the same age, let's call it a millennial experience or life for third generation exiled Palestinians. How do you situate your memoirs within this longer arc or tradition of the Palestinian memoir? And how do you see your individual contributions to this tradition? Abdalhadi, let's go back to you.
You always start with me, cornering me.
It's alphabetical.
I have to just follow up because I can see from the four books here, it has to do with the geography and the city. It always trigger me like the first city that after I got the Swedish citizenship to that I wanted to live in was Beirut. And that's why I moved to Beirut and I lived 4 or 5 years there. And it has a very similar atmosphere like Gaza because of the sea, because of the Al-Fakani and the area Sabra. So it became part of my memory. So and I tried to live elsewhere in the Middle East, but it doesn't work. Even Cairo, the one that's very close to Gaza, didn't work with me. But it's the sea, it's Gaza, it's the Beirut, it's the historical and so on. So this is very interesting to see how the location and geography can affect our own identity as well. Back to your question about my memoir. I think my memoir has 2 points. It can work as an inheritance and also as a departing point. And what I mean inheritance because it falls within the long tradition of the Palestinians. Yeah, I mean, Institute for Palestine Studies is very famous from the 70s about how Palestinians in Lebanon and in diaspora have been writing about the Palestine, about memory, about the preservation of the land, of the memory, of the traditions, of about the food and the narrative about the Nakba and so on. And then and that's why and how I situate this my book as part as an ongoing conversation with this kind of a tradition, a third generation exile. And of course, that's about talking about trees, about za'atar, about mornings, about the coffee, about the relationships, and so on. But here it's I'm writing the difference thing. I'm writing from a different place, and I mean here different place, not exile, different psychological place and different time, and what I mean time of genocide, time of constant wars and siege on Gaza, but also it's about the geographical place of Gaza itself. Everything happened within Palestine. It didn't happen outside Palestine. And that's maybe perhaps one of the new memories, and maybe this is the first memory about Gaza, a first book that talks about memoir from Gaza and within Gaza itself. And it happened there. So this is a uniqueness. And then something that's strike me also, what as third generation, we got the memory of Palestinian traditions mediated We didn't live it. We got it mediated through archive, through our research. Somebody told us. Recently, we started to document the oral history of us. But here so now we live the memory. Our generation and myself, I live the memory. I'm writing my own memory. I'm contemplating and writing something that's about somebody who is still alive, about somebody who maybe didn't die long time ago, and that's this memory is a way to center and to focus or let me to refocus the experience of us as a new generation without mediation. But also geographically and time, this it give us a new first-hand experience of three different times: post Oslo time, then post Second Intifada, the political polarization, Hamas and Fatah, and then the first Intifada as well. So we have some bits here and there of what happened in Gaza, but we didn't have it as documented. So this kind of memory, it contributes to the ongoing conversation. So in each of I think it's a commitment to memory and commitment to document uh, the most recent chapter of Palestinians in Gaza.
Thank you, Abdalhadi. Hala.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in terms of like, I I don't know that I spent too much. I mean, again, I think I spent so much time wrestling with the idea of even writing this that I I had at that point sort of come up to the edge of when the manuscript was due, if I may be completely honest, and I just owed them a book and had already been paid in part, and this isn't very glamorous, but like just kind of needed to put something together, and had already had so much writing. And then it was the sort of the task of stitching it together. And so I actually think I wrote this and put it together so quickly. And that's not to mean it's not to mean thoughtlessly or hastily, because a lot of it had already been written. It had just been written in different iterations, right? It had been written in the form of an essay or in the form of poetic prose or these sort of like shorter bluets like vignettes. But when the practice of assemblage came, that did kind of have to happen pretty quickly, and it was sort of early infant months, and it was a very chaotic time, and it was very tiring, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and I actually think that time felt like such a fever dream. And I am grateful for that, because I think if I'd had more time, I think I would have edited more heavily and I would have censored more, and I would have been like, you can't write about this. Like, you know what I mean? Your mom's gonna kill you. Or like, this is not a book for public consumption. This is gonna live forever. This is, and there's a part of me that's like, I'm grateful to have written something that is that was very honest and very yeah, like approach things that generally speaking feel kind of tabooed, or in terms of, talking about addiction, talking about sex, talking about eating disorders, talking about like kind of fractured familial relationships and how to try to make your way back into them. And so I hope that that is in the service of just like, yeah, just continuing to kind of encourage people to tell those sort of stories in the ways that feel authentic and safe to them. And then for me, the real reader, like the reader that I wait with bated breath for, um, is Layla, who may never read it, which I recognize. She might just be like, I'm so uninterested in this. I'm never gonna pick this up. But that like I do, that's kind of the reader that I'm like the most curious about if she ever does decide to read it. Um, because it was really written, I mean, for her, but for her, through her, about her, leading up to her. It's sort of the last record of who I am before I enter motherhood, and so there's something about that that also feels really poignant, painful. I mean, it's pain, like the story leading up to it is painful, but it's also, it's mine, and it's kind of all I have to offer in that way.
Thank you. there's so much bravery in each of your books and courage and sharing all that you do, despite the aib, the haram, the whatnot. So, Tareq, let's move on to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think, as I said at the beginning, because I didn't imagine that I was writing a memoir and didn't think that I was writing a memoir, I'm only coming to this retrospectively, if that makes sense. At the time, I wasn't thinking about contributing to this sort of long tradition of memoir writing. But now that I'm on the other side of this and I look back, and I've said this before, and I agree with the framing of the question and with what you were talking about, Abdulhadi. I think Palestinians have a very particular tradition of writing memoir for a clear reason. Our archives have been stolen and looted. There's global gaslighting of the Palestinian narrative. We insist on the Nakba, and then it only gets validated when revisionist Israeli historians talk about it. But we know the Nakba because of the stories that we tell ourselves. So this tradition of the Palestinian memoir is clearly one that's embedded within us. And I think it's incredible that we're continuing to write these memoirs. I've been reflecting on the fact that my grandparents lived through the Nakba. My parents lived through 67. We're living through the genocide in different positionalities, of course, but throughout this sort of ongoing Nakba and this settler colonial project, there are Palestinian narratives that are putting forward what it means to be Palestinian in this moment, in this age. And I think this is what these memoirs are doing. And I think it's a very powerful testament. That's why I think bringing the four of us on this platform, I think Nadim is also powerful because it's reflecting that reality and what we were talking about before, the place of city, Beirut and Amman and New York and Cairo and Shanghai. I mean, this is the Palestinian experience of dispossession and exile and dispersion. And I think the fact that we're able to hold on to our Palestinianness and to enact this as a project of resistance and grief, and to sort of insist on return and on daily coming back to this idea of this is what Palestine is, this is what we're fighting for, this is what these memoirs are doing. And I think it's incredibly powerful. And I think the last thing, I mean, just in terms of a very small sliver, again, not consciously done, but retroactively, I can put on my hat as an academic and talk about my memoir, is that I think for me, it was a very clear um, sort of exploration of queerness and Palestinianness and how these identities are in conversation, what they mean for me on a personal level, but also what they mean for the movement writ large. What does it mean to understand Palestine as a feminist struggle or a queer struggle, to think about these intersectionalities and to sort of embrace identities that are demonized or weaponized and use those as actually the metrics of our liberation. I think this is something that is fundamental to thinking about, Palestinian liberation in the 21st century. And for me, it comes from, I mean, I come to Palestine through queerness. There's no separation. It's not a political decision. It's an embodied one. And so I think exploring that was something that I hadn't realized at the time, but very vivid in my writing.
Absolutely. It's interwoven so powerfully in your book. May, let's end the question with you. There we go. Yeah, go ahead.
I have to admit that before writing this memoir, just familiarizing myself with Palestinian literature in general, and as much as I enjoyed it immensely, I really didn't see myself in it. Okay, I've never harvested an olive tree. I have never held a key of return. I've seen it on the wall of my families in other cities. I speak with an Egyptian accent. I was raised by my mother as Egyptian, although I'm not. So all that, so I got to a point where, but I am Palestinian. So, as Tareq was saying, whether you're in Shanghai or Amman, I am Palestinian, and maybe this is the new Palestinian, or at least my experience as a Palestinian, and it needs to be on the page. So the metaphors had to change, so that we have here queerness, we have surrogacy, we have the amputated foot. I see these as new metaphors for Palestine, to each his own, really. And I wanted to embrace these metaphors, and I wanted to introduce them in my book. In my case, also, there's the idea of time zones and, international calls and airports and fast food restaurants. These were all my metaphors for Palestine. How do I reach my family who are scattered all over the world? That's how it was done. So for me, it was like also the idea that even though we're twice removed from the origin home, the miraculously that doesn't dilute the strain; it actually strengthens it. That's how I saw it. And so I wanted to put that on the page, and I wanted to say that, Palestinians formed this gorgeous, vast, and varied tapestry, and there's a stitch that keeps repeating itself in variation, and that's okay because we're made to hold anyway, you see. So yeah, that was my intention going in,
I love this idea of like a new set of metaphors for what it means to be Palestinian with the new century and with the third generation. So thank you all. We have a bit more time for a second round of sort of catered questions, but maybe we won't start with Abdalhadi for this last round of questions. And as this we're coming up on an hour and a half, so I want to also give you a chance to Tareq earlier mentioning that you have so much more to say about whether it's Samud or anything else. So I just have a last question for each of you, and then if you would like to share some other thoughts or go in other directions, please by all means. We're not too sort of strict time-wise. If folks need to leave, please do. But this will be recorded and posted online anyway for educational purposes and for posterity. So we'd like to get as much out of this discussion as we can. Tariq, can we start with you, the next set of questions? Okay. Your memoir makes powerful interventions, as you were just mentioning, not just in the tradition of the Palestinian memoir, but also in queer and Arab queer literature. How do you think the Palestinian queer experience, and more specifically the exiled Palestinian queer experience, intervenes or contributes to these broader literatures?
Well, I mean, I think the queer Palestinian experience is a particular experience. In some ways, it's one that has resonances for the queer community in the broader region. All the things that we're talking about, around Aib, around conservatism, the patriarchy, homophobia, all of those ways that these manifest in the region exist, obviously, in Palestine. But there's a particular reality of the Palestinian queer experience, which is exacerbated by Zionism and pinkwashing, and this sort of notion that, the Palestinians are uncivilized, they're homophobic, Tel Aviv is the haven for the LGBTQ of the world, and therefore this is part of a civilizing project, that this is how we sort of get international legitimacy for our work of colonizing Palestine. I mean, the fact that there's a tank going into Gaza days after the genocide with Israeli soldiers unfurling a rainbow flag, saying, we're saving Gaza's gay community, is nauseating. And I think the queer community, the Palestinian queer community, is caught in that because they both want to obviously have their lives as queer individuals, but also first and foremost as Palestinians. So their main challenge is to undo settler colonialism, to undo the Nakba. But they end up being sort of forced in this space of proving their indigeneity, fighting these sort of imperial ways of co-opting their identity, fighting these sort of colonial ways of sort of positioning themselves as foreign, as not really from this place. And so I think there's really a very particular experience for queer Palestinians that I also think has in some ways actually reinforced intersectionality that's at the heart of the Palestinian struggle. And for movements like Al-Qaws and others that are coming out and saying actually queer individuals are indigenous to this land, we're from this land, and we're anti-empire, we're anti-Zionist, we're sort of focused on return. I think being able to have that decolonial framing on queerness is fundamental. And so I think that there's a very particular reality here. And I think for Palestinians who are queer in exile, we're also in a position where we're able to articulate these things away from the immediacy of the horrors. We're not being targeted by Israeli soldiers trying to get us to be collaborators. We're not being sort of necessarily weaponized in the same way. And we have a certain degree of luxury and privilege to be able to talk about these challenges. And so I think, just in terms of how the book contributes is there isn't a lot of queer literature that's memoir. There's some that's fiction, but even there, not a lot, and certainly not from Palestine and by Palestinians. But I've been inspired a lot by queer Arab writers. Abdallah was who's Moroccan, who writes primarily in French, was key to my writing. And so I see this book as being in conversation with some of the queer writers from the region, but also not only from the region, and placing Palestine and Palestinian memoir within that broader genre of queer memoir and queer literature.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tareq. May, I see you're unmuted, so let's let's go to you, May. May, your memoir traverses three timelines, one of which is imagined, the world of your ancestral village of El Kabri near Akka, where your father was born and from where he was expelled in 1948. We already talked about the power or the importance of imagination earlier, but tell us, what place does imagination hold in the Palestinian memoir and in your memoir, past, present, and maybe even future?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I think my headphones ran out of battery. So imagination for me it was a way to challenge the idea that I didn't have enough information, to say that between knowing and imagining, there is a space that I can bridge to actually deliver a full story. But to also, it was a survival strategy. Like I borrow from Ilyas Khoury, who borrows from 1001 Nights when he says in Gate of the Sun, to tell the story is to resist death, So it is about continuation, despite the challenges. But to also say that even though Israel has denied me the right of return, I can still return, at least on the page, and create space for my village through the literary imaginary. And that space would be part imagined and part historical fact. But the point is to create a space that you can never forget and to put it in a book that is mine and that no one can take away. Like you cannot, what are you going to do with a book? You cannot raise the book to the ground. You cannot, it's there for life. It's done, and to take ownership of this book as well, but also to evoke through imagination this village that for me I've elevated into like an almost mythical status, joy, to evoke a sense of joy and softness and intimacy against this ugliness and violence, and to say that we are still capable of imagining and returning to that place. But that return would also not be a return backwards. It's a return forward into possibility, the possibility of imagining this place. But I also see it as a political act to say that even though it no longer exists, I will bring it back. And even though you're trying to overwrite us, I can write a story that has a lasting power. At least that was my attempt. And even though I'm working against dislocation and silencing, I can still put it into beautiful words, you see. And that for me was largely achieved in the passages in Akka. There's a passage in the beginning where I even describe the pits inside the olives. I say 7 kinds of olives, and I describe every pit. And that's to say that even though I haven't seen it, I can see it through my imagination down to its most minute detail, you see, and that's challenging reality. At least that was the exercise I was after, you see. Yeah.
I love ending on an olive pit. Hala, let's move on to you. Your memoir is set farthest geographically from Palestine in the US, mostly, let's say, in the US, where you are now. For many reasons, the Palestinian American reality is unique and perhaps uniquely difficult within the context of the Western sphere and the Western diaspora experience. How do you hope your memoir is received in the US? And what do you hope it will teach US audiences about Palestine, about the Palestinian American experience, and so on?
If I'm being completely honest, I don't really care about teaching the US audience anything anymore. I think that I feel I do think it's a unique experience to have, yeah, to sort of inhabit two identities where you're filled with so much disgust, like continuous kind of um shame and both wanting to sort of abnegate or deny something or yeah. I mean, I don't I think I compared to my experience when my the first novel came out, which was about a Palestinian family, and I was probably 29 or 30 when it came out. It's about a year, about a decade ago. Um, I remember just being so preoccupied with this idea of reception and so like just perseveratory on this concept of like, would I be understood? Would it be read with good intent? Would it be, like, would there be kind of a good faith reception? How could I get people to see? How could I, like, I think I just as a person kind of have a preoccupation with being understood. And then to put that sort of on this like on an identity marker level, really just wanting and hoping that, people would receive the novel, would be able to. I remember there was a lot of talk the year that the novel came out around like humanizing. This book humanizes. This book is doing the work of humanizing. And I remember there was always something about it, but I don't know if it was like I don't want to hide behind age, but I think I might have been too young or maybe just too ignorant and maybe too afraid of losing whatever clout I felt like I had received by getting published, where I didn't want to contradict what felt like the sort of bigger or smarter people in the room. But I just remember always feeling like something was off with that phrasing and that there was something about it that didn't quite feel right. And now, of course, I have like a vocabulary for why it's kind of a nauseating thing to describe a book or a project as humanizing because wow, yeah. Um, and so I think like when I compare, for me, the best way to answer that is to say like when I think about what my publication process a decade ago was and how much I just wanted to like sit in front of, room after room, audience after audience, tour it and talk to different people and really hope that it would be read the way I wanted it to be read. And I just could not care less now. That is the truth. I really don't. I don't think it is not incumbent upon me to teach anybody anything. Everybody in this country has access to the same resources for the most part. And in terms of literature and libraries and internet, etc. And I think at this point, to not know something is to willfully decide not to know it. There's a choice making involved in it. And so, you know, so that rant aside, I think like I hope that it's received whether it's US or outside of it. I hope it's contributing something meaningful to just it's almost like for me the literature around or the memoir um a memoiristic aspect of writing about infertility, writing about the femme body, writing about like that almost is sort of where I have more interest in that being received a certain way or writing I write about sort of an abusive relationship I had in Beirut and a lot of intense kind of particular for my mother desires to sort of quell that writing about it or talking about it, etc. So like those I think that I hope is something that again is of service to people who've had those experiences or but around the Palestine in particular, I don't. It's like I just couldn't, I just don't care anymore. Like yeah, it's not my job, not my task. And um yeah. And it's that, I mean, talk about like the little bits of liberation we can kind of carve out for ourselves or track out for ourselves. I think that, and granted, it's like definitely a place of privilege to say, I can write a book and not care how it's received by, certain like swaths of communities. But I do think there is something liberatory about being like, look, I'm doing the best I can by capturing, pen to paper, a story and how that's received or whether that's going to be engaged with in a good faith way or not, I can't also clean both sides of the street. I can just do my task, and then how it is held and how it is carried is not my business really. Yeah.
Absolutely. As I lived in the United States for almost 20 years, so leaving was very freeing a few years ago, and since the genocide, it's just felt impossible
Yeah.
to go back. Impossible from what I hear. So I couldn't agree more that there is something liberatory in not caring how it's received by audiences who willfully choose
Exactly.
to not care, you know.
Exactly. No.
Abdulhadi, let's end with you and with Gaza. Um, your memoir, as we mentioned, is a family story, and it's set in Gaza across not just your lifespan, but your family's lifespan as well, generations. It ends with your exile, and then it ends in December 2024, genocide. As a Palestinian from Gaza who survived against all odds and who has shared with the world reflections on this life and on Gaza from exile, what has writing this memoir been for you? What has it taught you or revealed to you about yourself, about the Palestinian condition, about Gaza? Please.
Thank you. Well, it's a different time or a different feeling when you write actually from outside Gaza. But I have to confess to a few things before. The majority, 95% of it was written before the genocide, maybe even more. So that's why. And I didn't read it after that because I didn't want to change anything that influenced me during the genocide. So that's just one. The second confession is that I started the first piece actually in 2014 as a response to what happened in Gaza in 2014. And I went to a therapist, and then the therapist told me like, okay, what we should do that in Sweden, what we should do is we can start with writing. And I wrote one story, two, three, and then I took them, I still remember, printed them and took them, and he read them and told me like, listen, stop writing because it's too Kafkaesque. So I stopped writing and then I came back later on. So I think what it taught me during this perspective 5 years writing it is that survival is fragile, and it doesn't come as a natural linear process, but it's actually a permanent state of negotiation within ourselves, but also within our surroundings. So for all my life, I understood survival and resilience and this as an ordinary way. I understood that the Israeli occupation, tear gassing us at school, to shoot my classmate, that my neighborhood to be killed by Israeli, to wake up at 4 o'clock while the Israeli soldiers' boots are on my face and sleeping in my bed. It was an ordinary thing for me. I didn't catch it until it became something visible. So living under the Israeli colonization has been normalized for the most part of my time in Gaza, my age. It was our destiny to be so. But from exile, the cost is really huge, and the cost is double, and even if it's not more. While you are in the genocide, which during these 2 years, I always, not sleeping or sleeping, I always say one thing, يا ليتني كنت معهم. I wish I am with my family because I didn't. It's a constant type of fear and struggle within. So it's not easy. So it shows how deeply the colonization has altered our time, our psychology, type of grief as well. So it's as I survived. I usually say that after 2007 when I left Gaza, all my age is a surplus. It's just something that was given for me. It's of time if you play football. So it's time off. So for me here is distance here when as part of learning process or how I write, it became a protection and also a curse and a wound, constant wound that I have to clean it always. And that's why writing have taught me like and helped me to be more sane sometimes. So I express more with writing that can help me not decrease, but I can say to free myself from type of guilt, survival guilt that I still have feeling and I still have suffering from. So it's surviving guilt, and it will continue to be with us, especially after my mother. I think also it taught me that writing is an instant or a constant refusal to surrender and a reminder for me that the Nakba or what we are witnessing is not a second Nakba, but rather is a continuation within the Nakba itself.
Thank you, Abdalhadi. النكبة المستمرة, the ongoing Nakba indeed. We can keep talking for hours, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to congratulate each of you again on your beautiful books and to thank you for joining us for this discussion. Your reflections on your lives as Palestinians at this time of the annihilation of Palestinian life couldn't be timelier and more inspiring. You've certainly inspired me to reflect on my own life as a third generation exiled Palestinian in Amman. I very much look forward to seeing the continued growth of this genre that you've charted and to the growth of the genre of the Palestinian memoir. So thank you to each of you for your contributions, and thank you also to our audience for your attendance. Please remember to check our latest issue of JPS and to support the Institute if you can. To do so, please click on the link in the chat box. From Amman, I wish you all continued strength and patience, and good night.
Thank you, Nadim. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you so much, Nadim.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.